Ethan and his mother, Claire, are doing everything they can to survive in a world that often seems determined to hold them back. Struggling against poverty, an unstable home, and painful memories, they're used to facing life's challenges alone. But when a chance encounter brings Lucas, a compassionate stranger with a mysterious past, into their lives, everything begins to change. With Lucas's support, Claire and Ethan start to find stability and purpose. Yet as they try to build a better future, shadows from the past linger, threatening to undo their progress. In this story, we follow Claire and Ethan as they learn to trust, rebuild, and find strength they never knew they had. But will Lucas's help be enough to truly lift them out of their old life? And what happens when Ethan is confronted by those who refuse to let him forget his past? If you're ready to see how this story unfolds, subscribe now and join us as we dive into the journey of resilience, hope, and second chances. Leave a comment to share your thoughts along the way. What would you do if you were in their shoes? Let's begin. The afternoon heat in Crestwood was relentless, pressing down like a thick blanket that weighed on everyone who dared to step outside. The summer had arrived in full force, and every inch of concrete and asphalt seemed to glow with heat, like an enormous oven trapping the whole neighborhood inside. The sidewalks were almost empty, except for a few people here and there, quick to rush from the shade of one building to another, trying to avoid the baking sun. But Ethan Green, a wiry 12-year-old with short, messy brown hair and sharp, watchful eyes, sat cross-legged on the cracked concrete step outside his apartment building, watching the street with the quiet patience of someone who has long since learned not to expect anything better. He wore a faded t-shirt 2 sizes too big, with small holes at the hem and a patch on the left sleeve where his mom had mended a tear from last summer. His sneakers were scuffed and thin, with the soles worn nearly smooth. The intense heat from the sidewalk had seeped through them hours ago, and now he shifted from side to side, trying to give his feet some relief. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the street across from him, where he could see the bustling entrance of Crestwood Mart. He watched as people went in and out, carrying plastic bags full of groceries, ice cream, and cold drinks. Some of them were in shorts and sandals, fanning themselves or sipping from cold bottles as they walked. There were people who looked like they had somewhere to be, people with a purpose, people who didn't mind the heat too much because they could escape it as soon as they got back to their cars, or homes with working air conditioning. Ethan tugged at the collar of his t-shirt, which was sticking to his neck. He was used to the heat by now. Crestwood always seemed hot, no matter the season. But he'd always felt it was worse in the summer, when the afternoons stretched on for hours and hours. He'd spent a lot of his summer days just like this one, sitting outside, waiting for something to happen, or for his mom to come home. He squinted against the sun, his stomach rumbling quietly. It was almost time for Claire to finish work. She'd been cleaning houses all morning, and her shift was supposed to end at 3. It was now closer to 4, and Ethan's stomach hadn't seen anything more than a handful of dry cereal that morning. The thought of waiting much longer didn't sit well with him, but he knew better than to complain. His mother worked herself to exhaustion every day, and he wouldn't add to her stress. "Hey, you there," a loud, gruff voice called out. Ethan glanced up to see Pete, the owner of Crestwood Mart, standing across the street, looking at him with a frown. Pete was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and a scowl that seemed permanently fixed on his face. He wore a stained apron and a cap that barely stayed on his head, and he didn't look particularly pleased to see Ethan loitering around. Ethan nodded politely. "Hi, Mr. Pete," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Pete gave him a hard look, crossing his arms. "You're not up to anything, are you?" Ethan shook his head quickly. "Just waiting for my mom, sir. She'll be back soon." Pete grunted, his scowl deepening. "I don't want you causing trouble. You hear? Keep to yourself and don't bother the customers." Ethan nodded again, used to this sort of exchange. "Yes, sir. Just waiting." Pete gave him one last look before turning back to his store, muttering something under his breath as he disappeared through the sliding glass doors. Ethan's shoulders slumped a little, but he stayed where he was. It wasn't the first time Pete had been suspicious of him. Pete always seemed to think that kids hanging around meant trouble, especially kids like Ethan, kids who didn't have new clothes or the kind of money that let them buy a soda and a snack every time they went out. Ethan waited until Pete was back inside the store, then turned his gaze back to the street. His stomach growled louder this time, and he shifted uncomfortably. He wished he'd eaten a little more that morning, but food wasn't something they had in abundance. Sometimes he managed to pick up a few extra cans or bottles to recycle for some spare change, and that was enough to buy a small snack. But today his luck had been thin. Just as he was starting to think he might get up and wander, he saw her, Claire, his mom, walking up the sidewalk, her shoulders slumped, her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. She wore her usual cleaning uniform, a faded gray shirt and navy pants, both stained and slightly too big. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the exhaustion on her face, the way her feet dragged with every step. He pushed himself up, brushing the dust off his pants, and waved as she approached. Claire saw him and smiled, her tired face lighting up just a little. She reached out and gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze as she reached him. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but warm. "You been waiting long?" "Nah," Ethan replied, trying to sound casual. "Just been sitting here, watching." Claire chuckled, though it was a weary sound. "Watching, huh? Well, let's head on up. I think there's still some soup left from last night. We can have a little dinner, all right?" Ethan nodded, falling in a step beside her as they made their way into the building. The old structure was worn and shabby, with peeling paint and cracked walls. The stairwell smelled faintly of mildew, and the steps creaked under their weight as they climbed up to the third floor. Their apartment was at the end of a narrow hallway, its doors slightly warped from years of wear. Inside, it was small but clean, with a few pieces of worn furniture and a tiny kitchen that barely fit the two of them. Claire set her bag down on the counter and went to the cabinet, pulling out a can of soup and a couple of bowls. Ethan sat at the table, watching as she poured the soup into a pot on the stove and turned on the burner. The kitchen was dimly lit, with only a single bulb above them, and the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. He could see the lines of fatigue etched into his mother's face, the way her hands moved slowly, as if each action took twice the effort. They didn't talk much as they ate. The soup was thin and lukewarm, but Ethan didn't mind. He was just glad to be eating something. He glanced at Claire every now and then, noticing the way she kept glancing at the stack of envelopes on the counter. He knew what those were: bills, notices, things she didn't want him to worry about, but that weighed on her all the same. After dinner, Claire stood by the counter, her gaze lingering on a particular envelope. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper as she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. Ethan recognized the envelope. It was from their landlord, Mr. Randall, and he knew what it meant. Ethan looked up, trying to keep his voice steady. Is everything okay?" Claire turned, managing a small, reassuring smile. "Oh, it's nothing, honey. Just another notice from Mr. Randall. We're a little behind on rent, that's all." Ethan nodded, swallowing the knot of worry that rose in his throat. Mr. Randall was a tall, balding man with a sharp face and an even sharper tone, someone who didn't like being inconvenienced. They'd been late with rent a few times before, and each time, he'd shown up with the same stern warnings, the same veiled threats. Do we have enough to pay him?" Ethan asked quietly. Claire's smile faltered, and she looked away, her fingers tightening around the envelope. "We'll figure it out," she murmured. "We always do, don't we?" Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it this time. He could see the worry in her eyes, the way she kept glancing at the envelope as if it might somehow change if she stared hard enough. As the evening wore on, they sat together in the small living room, each lost in their own thoughts. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted in through the thin walls, the faint hum of traffic, the distant laughter of children playing, the occasional shout from someone on the street below. Ethan felt a quiet, gnawing anxiety settle in his chest, a sense that things were slipping out of their control. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about what it would be like to have a life that wasn't always so hard, so uncertain. He imagined what it might feel like to have a full meal every night, to live in a place where the walls didn't crack and the floors didn't creak. He pictured his mom smiling, without the weight of worry pulling down her shoulders. But these thoughts were only dreams, distant and out of reach. He knew better than to let himself hope too much. It was just the way things were, and he had to accept it. Still, as he drifted off to sleep, A small part of him held onto the faintest sliver of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness. The next morning, Ethan woke early, the dim light of dawn casting a pale glow through the cracks in the window blinds. Claire was already gone, having left for her shift at sunrise. Ethan got dressed quickly, grabbing his backpack and slipping out of the apartment, his stomach still a little hollow from last night's thin dinner. He headed down the street, walking with his shoulders hunched slightly, his gaze fixed on the pavement. His mind was occupied with thoughts of how he might be able to make a few extra dollars that day. Maybe he could find more cans to recycle, or see if anyone in the neighborhood needed help with errands. It wasn't much, but every bit helped. As he walked, he kept an eye out for empty bottles and cans, picking up whatever he could find and stuffing them into his backpack. The streets were quiet this early, with most of the stores still closed and only a few people out and about. He felt a strange sense of calm in the stillness, a brief reprieve from the usual noise and hustle of the neighborhood. But as he turned down a side street, he spotted a figure leaning against a lamppost up ahead, and his stomach clenched. It was Calvin, a tall, wiry teenager with a cocky grin and a reputation for being trouble. Calvin had dropped out of school last year and spent most of his time hanging around Crestwood, demanding protection fees from younger kids who couldn't fight back. Ethan's instinct was to turn around and walk away, but Calvin had already seen him, and there was no point in running. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and kept walking, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Hey, scavenger boy," Calvin called out, his tone mocking. "What's in the bag?" Ethan tightened his grip on his backpack, not meeting Calvin's gaze. Just cans," he muttered. Calvin smirked, stepping closer. "Just cans, huh? Let's see what you've got." He reached out, grabbing the strap of Ethan's backpack and yanking it open. The cans clattered out, spilling onto the pavement. Ethan watched helplessly as Calvin picked up one of the cans, examining it with a sneer. "This all you've got? Pathetic." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. I need them. For my mom." Calvin laughed, tossing the can back on the ground. "Your mom, huh? Well, maybe you should think about paying me a little fee if you want to keep picking up cans around here. Call it a protection fee." Ethan felt a surge of anger rise up inside him, but he bit it back, knowing that fighting back would only make things worse. "I don't have any money," he said quietly. Calvin shrugged, his smirk widening. "Then you'd better find some. I'll be around, scavenger boy." With that, he shoved Ethan back and walked away, leaving him standing there with his scattered cans and a hollow ache in his chest. Ethan bent down, gathering the cans back into his backpack, his hands trembling slightly. The fear and frustration churned inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to keep moving. He knew that in this neighborhood, standing up to someone like Calvin was a dangerous game. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change, that he couldn't keep living in fear forever. By the time Friday afternoon arrived, the temperature had risen sharply, casting a shimmering haze over Crestwood's sidewalks and storefronts. Ethan found himself in his usual spot, watching the world pass by with a wary kind of fascination. His eyes followed people who walked with purpose, moms tugging small children along, teenagers chattering as they shared earbuds, and business people with briefcases, looking oddly out of place in this part of town. As he waited, his stomach rumbled insistently. He hadn't eaten since breakfast. A piece of toast Claire had left him before she'd rushed out for her early shift. Now, the familiar ache of hunger had settled in, and he glanced around, hoping he might spot a stray coin or two on the ground to put toward a snack. The rumble of an engine pulled his attention, and he watched as a sleek black sedan pulled to a stop near the curb. The car was a far cry from the usual rundown vehicles parked along the street, its glossy exterior gleaming in the sunlight. The door opened, and a man stepped out, a tall figure in a crisp, tailored suit that looked as though it belonged more in a downtown office than in Crestwood's worn streets. The man adjusted his sunglasses, surveying the neighborhood with a casual, unhurried air. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with salt and pepper hair combed back neatly and a calm, steady presence that somehow made him seem approachable despite his expensive clothes. Ethan watched him, curious but wary. People like this man didn't usually come to Crestwood, and if they did, they certainly didn't linger. But the man seemed in no rush, glancing around as if he were simply taking in the scenery. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might look away. But the man held his gaze, his expression unreadable but calm. After a moment, he started toward Ethan, crossing the street with a steady, confident stride. "Hey there," the man said, stopping a few feet in front of him. His voice was smooth, friendly but direct. Ethan stiffened, unsure how to respond. He knew better than to talk to strangers, but something about the man's demeanor didn't set off the usual alarms. The man didn't look like someone who'd caused trouble. He looked kind somehow. "You look like you could use a break," the man continued, his tone light. "Pretty hot out here, isn't it?" Ethan shrugged, trying to keep his expression neutral. I'm used to it." The man tilted his head, as if considering him. "Fair enough," he said. "But how about a cold drink?" "My treat." Ethan hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. He wasn't used to people offering him things out of the blue, especially not strangers in suits who looked like they belonged in skyscrapers and boardrooms. "I'm not supposed to go with strangers," Ethan replied, his voice cautious. The man's mouth quirked into a small smile, and he nodded approvingly. "Smart kid," he said. "How about this? We'll go across the street to that diner." He pointed to Joy's Diner, a small, cozy-looking spot with a neon sign that buzzed faintly in the afternoon light. "You pick a seat where everyone can see us, and you can leave anytime you want." "Deal." Ethan hesitated, glancing between the diner and the man. He thought about the last time he'd had a real meal, a hot meal that wasn't just soup or leftovers. His stomach gave another loud growl, and he finally nodded, his curiosity winning out. "Okay," he said quietly. "But just for a little while." The man nodded, gesturing for him to lead the way. They crossed the street together, and the bell over the diner's door chimed softly as they entered. Inside, the air was cool and refreshing, a welcome change from the sticky heat outside. The tables were scattered with a handful of customers, a couple of older women chatting over coffee, a man reading a newspaper, and a young family at a booth by the window. Ethan chose a booth near the front, where he had a clear view of the street. He slid into the seat, his eyes flicking to the door as if to reassure himself that he could still leave if he wanted. The man took a seat across from him, sliding his sunglasses into his pocket. Without them, his face looked kinder, his eyes a warm shade of gray that seemed to hold a hint of understanding. "My name's Lucas," he said, extending his hand. "Lucas Warren." Ethan looked at the outstretched hand, hesitating for a moment before reaching out and shaking it. "I'm Ethan," he replied. "Nice to meet you, Ethan." Lucas released his hand, settling back into the booth as he picked up a menu. "Order whatever you like. No need to hold back." Ethan glanced at the menu, his eyes widening slightly as he scanned the options. Burgers, sandwiches, milkshakes, all things that seemed like luxuries compared to what he was used to. He bit his lip, trying to decide, until Lucas gave him an encouraging nod. "It's okay," Lucas said gently. "Go ahead." Ethan took a deep breath, finally settling on a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. He felt a mix of excitement and guilt as he handed the menu back to the waitress, who gave him a kind smile before disappearing into the kitchen. Lucas watched him with a thoughtful expression, his hands resting on the table. "So, Ethan," he said, his tone casual, "what brings you to this part of town?" Ethan shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. "I live here." Lucas raised an eyebrow, nodding as if he'd suspected as much. "With your family?" "Just me and my mom," Ethan replied, his gaze dropping to his hands. He didn't like talking about his family or the lack of it, but something about Lucas's steady, non-judgmental gaze made him feel a little less guarded. "Your mom must work hard," Lucas said, his voice gentle. "It's not easy raising a family on your own." Ethan nodded, glancing up briefly. "Yeah, she works all the time, cleaning houses, offices, whatever she can find." Lucas's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "Sounds like she's doing her best, and I can see that you're doing your part too." Ethan felt a flicker of pride, but he quickly looked away, not wanting Lucas to see how much the words meant to him. Most people barely noticed him, much less acknowledged what he did to help his mom. The food arrived a few minutes later, and Ethan's stomach growled as the waitress set the plate in front of him. He took a tentative bite of the burger, the flavors rich and comforting, far better than anything he'd tasted in a long time. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Lucas sipped his coffee and watched him with a quiet, almost fatherly expression. As Ethan finished his meal, Lucas leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but serious. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" Ethan looked up, nodding warily. "If you could change one thing about your life," Lucas asked, his gaze steady, "what would it be?" Ethan thought for a moment, the question catching him off guard. He wasn't used to thinking about his life that way, as if he had the power to change anything. But after a moment he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd make things easier for my mom," he said, his eyes focused on the empty plate. "I just want her to be happy, to not have to work so hard all the time." Lucas nodded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "That's a good answer, Ethan. You're a good son." Ethan felt his face flush slightly, and he looked down, embarrassed but also strangely proud. No one had ever said that to him before, not like that. After a moment, Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, sliding it across the table to Ethan. "Listen," he said, his voice calm and steady. "If you or your mom ever need a little extra help, don't hesitate to call me. I mean it." Ethan picked up the card, studying it carefully. The card was simple, with Lucas's name printed in neat letters. Lucas Warren, Financial Services. Below his name was a phone number, handwritten in blue ink. Why are you helping us?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lucas smiled, a soft, almost sad smile. "Because I know what it's like to need a helping hand," he replied. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person to make a difference." Ethan nodded slowly, slipping the card into his pocket as if it were a precious treasure. He didn't fully understand why Lucas had reached out to him, but a part of him, an instinct buried deep, felt that this was something real, something that could change things. They left the diner a few minutes later, and as Ethan stepped back into the summer heat, he felt a strange sense of hope blossoming in his chest, like a small, fragile flower pushing its way through the cracks in the sidewalk. He turned to thank Lucas one last time, but the man had already slipped into his car, giving him a final nod and a wave before pulling away. Ethan watched as the black sedan disappeared down the street, clutching the card tightly in his hand. Maybe, he thought, just maybe, things didn't have to stay the same forever. When Ethan arrived home later that evening, Claire was there, standing by the small kitchen counter, sorting through the day's mail. She looked up as he walked in, her face softening with a tired smile. "Hey, honey," she greeted him. "You were out a bit longer than usual today." Ethan shrugged, slipping off his backpack and setting it by the door. "Yeah, I went to Joy's diner." Claire raised an eyebrow, glancing at him curiously. "By yourself?" Ethan hesitated, glancing down at the floor. "No, I met someone, a man named Lucas. He bought me lunch." A flicker of surprise crossed Claire's face, quickly replaced by a wary look. She set the stack of mail down, crossing her arms as she studied him. "Ethan, you know you're not supposed to talk to strangers." "I know, Mom," he replied quickly. But he wasn't just any stranger. He was different. He just wanted to help. Claire's expression softened slightly, but she still looked uncertain. "Ethan, people don't just help out of the kindness of their hearts. Especially not people we don't know." Ethan felt a small pang of disappointment, but he kept his voice steady. He gave me this." He reached into his pocket, pulling out Lucas's card and handing it to her. Claire took the card, reading it carefully. Her brows knitted together, and she bit her lip, her expression thoughtful but skeptical. "Financial services," she murmured, almost to herself. "What did he say exactly?" "He said if we ever needed help, we could call him," Ethan replied. "He knows what it's like to struggle, Mom." "I believe him." Claire looked at the card for a long moment, her face troubled. She wanted to believe in the possibility of kindness, of good people willing to help, but years of hardship had taught her to be cautious, to keep her guard up. She tucked the card into her pocket, giving Ethan a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll see," she said softly, ruffling his hair. "But for now, let's not get our hopes up too high, all right?" Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas's offer was real, that it was something they could rely on. As he went to bed that night, he found himself thinking of Lucas's calm, steady voice, the warmth in his eyes, and the quiet promise he'd made. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a life where things might be different, a life where hope was more than just a distant dream. Claire lay awake long after Ethan had fallen asleep, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over. She hadn't heard Ethan so animated in a long time, not since he'd met this man, Lucas. It made her uneasy, the way he had put his trust so quickly into a stranger's hands. In her experience, people didn't just appear out of nowhere with good intentions. In Crestwood, everything came with strings attached. Yet, there was something about the way Ethan had described Lucas, the steady kindness in his voice, the way he'd listened without judgment. And when Claire looked down at the small business card in her hand, she couldn't deny the small flutter of hope it stirred in her. She'd learned to smother hope long ago, but now, staring at Lucas's name in the dim light, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, this man really did want to help. The next morning, she made her way to the small diner where she'd first met Mrs. Donnelly, the manager of the cleaning company where she worked. It was quiet, the kind of place where people gathered in small groups, nursing coffee and talking in low voices. As she sat down at a corner booth, she pulled out the business card again, turning it over in her hands. A waitress came by, a warm, older woman with a kind smile and a sharp eye that seemed to take everything in. She refilled Claire's coffee, nodding at the card in her hand. "Looking for a job or something?" the waitress asked, glancing down at the card. Claire gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Not exactly," she replied. "Someone gave it to my son, actually, said we could call if we needed help." The waitress raised an eyebrow, looking impressed. "Not many people offer that kind of help around here." "You're lucky." Claire bit her lip, looking down at the card. "Yeah, I'm not sure what to think. People don't usually help out of nowhere, do they?" The waitress gave a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes, honey, they do. You'd be surprised. It's a rare thing, but when it happens, it can change your life." Claire nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the card. The words settled over her like a quiet encouragement, and for the first time, she let herself think about what it might be like to accept help without feeling indebted. She left the diner a few minutes later, the business card still tucked in her hand, and a new sense of possibility blooming in her chest. That afternoon, Ethan sat on the worn sofa in their apartment, his fingers drumming anxiously on his knee. He knew his mom was still hesitant about Lucas, and he understood why. Life had taught them both to be cautious, to expect disappointment. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas was different, that maybe, just this once, trusting someone wasn't a mistake. The sound of his mom's key turning in the lock snapped him out of his thoughts. She stepped inside, carrying a small grocery bag in one hand, and her purse slung over her shoulder. She looked more relaxed than usual, her face softened by an expression Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. "Hey, honey," she greeted him, setting the grocery bag on the counter. "Guess what?" "What?" Ethan asked, curious. Claire gave a small smile, almost hesitant. "I called Lucas." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, a mixture of excitement and relief washing over him. "You did? What did he say?" "He invited us to lunch tomorrow," she replied. "Said he'd like to talk, get to know us a little better." I told him I wasn't sure yet, but he seemed understanding." Ethan's face lit up. "Mom, that's great. I knew he'd be nice." Claire chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "We'll see, Ethan. I'm still not convinced, but I figured, well, it couldn't hurt to listen." For the rest of the evening, Ethan was more animated than he'd been in weeks, chattering on about what they might order and wondering what Lucas might say. Claire couldn't help but feel her heart lift, too, though she tried to keep her expectations low. Still, a part of her was cautiously hopeful, a part she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in a long time. The next day, Claire and Ethan walked to a small Italian restaurant a few blocks from their apartment. The restaurant was cozy, with dim lighting and the faint smell of garlic and herbs filling the air. They didn't go to places like this often. Usually, a meal out meant grabbing a slice of pizza or a sandwich from the deli down the street. But today felt special, a small reprieve from their usual routine. Lucas was already seated at a table by the window, wearing a dark blue button-down shirt and looking as relaxed as ever. He stood up as they approached, greeting them with a warm smile. "Claire, Ethan, it's great to see you both," he said, extending a hand to Claire. She shook his hand, nodding politely. Thank you for inviting us. And for what you did for Ethan. He told me about the lunch you bought him the other day. Lucas smiled, his gaze gentle. It was my pleasure. He's a good kid. Reminded me a bit of myself when I was his age. They took their seats, and a waitress brought them menus, along with glasses of water. Ethan's eyes widened as he looked over the options, his mouth practically watering as he read descriptions of pasta, pizza, and sandwiches. Order whatever you like, Lucas encouraged, smiling at Ethan's excitement. It's on me. Claire hesitated, glancing over the menu with a cautious look. This is very generous of you, Lucas, but I don't want you to feel obligated to help us. Lucas's smile softened. I don't feel obligated, Claire. I know it's not easy to accept help, but I'm here because I want to be. I've been where you are, and I know how hard it can be. Ethan looked up from his menu, his eyes shining with admiration. Really? You've been through stuff like this? Lucas nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Yes. My mom and I struggled for a long time. She worked 3 jobs, barely had time to sleep, and we lived in an apartment not much different from yours. He paused, a faraway look in his eyes. One day, someone noticed me a man who owned a small shop near our place. He took me under his wing, gave me odd jobs, and over time, he helped me find my way out. I wouldn't be here without him. Claire listened quietly, her skepticism slowly melting as she saw the sincerity in Lucas's eyes. He wasn't just saying this to earn their trust. He was speaking from experience, from a place of genuine understanding. So now, you want to help others? She asked softly. Lucas nodded. Ido, I've been fortunate, and now I want to give back. It's not about charity or pity, it's about lifting people up, helping them see the possibilities they might not know are there. For the first time, Claire felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting from her chest. Maybe this man was the real deal. Maybe he was someone they could trust. They ordered their meals, and the conversation drifted to lighter topics. Lucas asked Ethan about school, listened intently as he talked about his favorite subjects, and even shared a few of his own school memories, making Ethan laugh with stories about his misadventures in science class. As the meal went on, Claire found herself relaxing more, laughing at Ethan's jokes, and enjoying the easy flow of conversation. Lucas was patient, kind, and attentive, treating them both with a respect that felt unfamiliar but welcome. When they finally finished their meal, Lucas leaned forward, his gaze warm and earnest. Claire, Ethan, I'd like to offer you both a little more than just lunch. If you ever need anything, a ride, some extra groceries, anything at all, I'm just a phone call away. Claire nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. Thank you, Lucas. I appreciate that more than you know. As they stood to leave, Lucas gave Ethan a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You're a strong kid, Ethan. I can see that. Keep doing what you're doing, and don't ever lose hope. Ethan grinned, his face flushed with pride. Thank you, Mr. Lucas. I won't. They parted ways outside the restaurant, and as they walked home, Claire felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She knew their lives wouldn't magically transform overnight, but for the first time, she felt like they weren't alone. They had someone in their corner, someone who believed in them. That night, as she watched Ethan fall asleep with a contented smile on his face, she made a quiet promise to herself. No matter what challenges they faced, she would hold on to this small glimmer of hope for herself and for Ethan. The following week, as Ethan walked home from school, he noticed Calvin and his friends hanging out by the corner store. Calvin caught sight of him, a sly grin spreading across his face as he nudged one of his friends. Hey, scavenger boy, Calvin called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Ethan's stomach tightened, but he kept walking, trying to ignore the taunts. He knew Calvin well enough to understand that showing fear would only make things worse. But as he passed by, Calvin stepped into his path, blocking his way. Where you headed in such a hurry? Calvin sneered. Thought you might have learned by now, this is our turf. Ethan clenched his fists, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. I don't want any trouble, Calvin. Just let me go home. Calvin chuckled, his eyes cold and calculating. You know, I heard you've been making new friends. Some fancy guy in a suit, huh? Think he can save you from us? Ethan's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He hadn't told anyone about Lucas, but word had spread fast in their neighborhood. Calvin's tone was mocking, as if he couldn't believe someone like Lucas would bother helping a kid like Ethan. "Just leave me alone," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. Calvin laughed, leaning closer. "You'd better watch yourself, scavenger boy. Don't think your new friend can keep you safe forever." Ethan forced himself to stand his ground, meeting Calvin's gaze with a quiet determination. "I don't need him to protect me," he replied, his voice firm. "I'm not afraid of you." Calvin's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, giving Ethan a hard shove before stepping back. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning away with a sneer. As Ethan walked away, his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and defiance. He knew he couldn't let Calvin intimidate him forever, but he also understood that standing up to someone like Calvin was risky. Still, he felt a newfound strength growing inside him, a strength that Lucas's kindness had sparked. When he got home, he found Claire sitting at the kitchen table, reading over a stack of bills. She looked up as he entered, her face softening with a tired smile. "Hey, honey," she greeted him. "How was your day?" Ethan hesitated, debating whether to tell her about Calvin. But he saw the worry already etched into her face, and he decided to keep it to himself. "Good," he replied with a smile. "Really good." Claire nodded, reaching out to give his hand a reassuring squeeze. "That's my boy." As he sat down to do his homework, Ethan felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to face it with courage, just as Lucas had taught him. And no matter what, he knew he had his mother by his side, cheering him on. The days turned into weeks, and while life hadn't transformed overnight, Ethan and Claire began to notice small but meaningful changes. Lucas visited regularly, each time bringing a bit of comfort, a bag of groceries, a stack of gently used books for Ethan, even a small care package of cleaning supplies for Claire. His presence was warm and steady, like a lighthouse guiding them through the uncertainty that had always shadowed their lives. Ethan felt a kind of joy he hadn't known in years. For once, he didn't have to constantly worry about how they'd get by. He was beginning to see school not just as a place to pass time, but as an opportunity to grow, to prove he could be someone. He'd started paying attention in class with renewed focus, finding satisfaction in learning, even when the material was challenging. One afternoon, Lucas arrived at their apartment with an unexpected offer. "Claire, Ethan," he began, his tone calm, but filled with purpose. "I want you to think about something." Claire looked up from the kitchen counter, where she'd been sorting through bills. She'd been working extra shifts and doing everything she could to save, but the stack of overdue notices hadn't stopped growing. She set down the papers, her brows furrowing as she met Lucas's gaze. "Think about what?" she asked, her tone wary but curious. Lucas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I own an apartment building in a quieter neighborhood," he said. "It's clean, safe, and closer to better schools. I'd like to offer you both a place there somewhere you can settle in without constantly worrying about everything." Ethan's eyes widened, and he looked to his mom with barely contained excitement. The idea of moving somewhere new, somewhere stable and safe, was almost too much to believe. His fingers tightened around the pencil in his hand, his heart pounding with hope. Claire's face was a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Lucas, that's incredibly generous," she began slowly. "But we can't afford rent in a nicer neighborhood. I appreciate what you're offering, but it's just not possible." Lucas shook his head gently, his expression kind. "I wouldn't be offering if I expected you to shoulder this alone, Claire. You're both hardworking, determined, exactly the kind of people I want in my building. The first few months would be covered, and after that, we'll work something out based on what you can afford." Claire's eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and doubt. She was quiet for a moment, the words settling over her like a warm blanket on a cold day. The thought of leaving behind the constant stress, the fears that kept her up at night, was appealing. Yet, part of her couldn't help but feel hesitant, wary of accepting something so big. I don't know," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "What if we can't keep up? What if—" "You can," Lucas interrupted gently, his gaze unwavering. "And I'll be here to help. This isn't charity, Claire, it's a partnership. A chance for you and Ethan to start fresh." Ethan looked at his mom, his eyes wide with hope. Mom, please. It could be a real home. Claire took a deep, steadying breath, her gaze shifting between Ethan and Lucas. She saw the hope in her son's eyes, a light she hadn't seen in years. And for once, she let herself believe that maybe this was real, that maybe they could start over. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. All right, let's give it a try. The following weekend, Claire and Ethan packed up their small apartment with the help of Lucas and a couple of movers he'd hired. Their belongings fit into a few boxes and bags, a stark reminder of how little they'd accumulated over the years. But as they loaded the boxes into the moving truck, Claire felt an unexpected surge of optimism. This was more than just a move. It was a new beginning. Lucas led them to the apartment, building a modest, brick structure with wide windows and a small, neatly kept garden out front. Ethan gazed up at the building in awe, barely able to contain his excitement. It was a far cry from their old place, with its cracked walls and broken windows. As they entered the lobby, Claire noticed how clean everything was: the polished floors, the potted plants by the entrance, the faint scent of fresh paint. The air itself felt lighter, free from the dust and decay that had clung to their old building. Lucas led them up to the fourth floor, stopping in front of a door labeled Unit 407. He handed Claire the key, giving her an encouraging smile. "Welcome home," he said softly. Claire took a deep breath, inserting the key and turning the lock. The door swung open, revealing a bright, airy living space with hardwood floors, a small but modern kitchen, and a large window that filled the room with sunlight. She stepped inside, taking in the spaciousness, the cleanliness, the quiet. It was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. Ethan raced past her, exploring every corner of the apartment with wide-eyed wonder. "Mom, look," he called from one of the bedrooms. "There's a desk and a closet." Claire followed him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude as she watched her son's excitement. She placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "We're going to be okay here," she whispered, a soft smile tugging at her lips. Ethan nodded, his face glowing with happiness. "Yeah, we are." The next few weeks were like a dream for Ethan and Claire. Each day, they discovered new things about their apartment and neighborhood, small luxuries that others might take for granted, but which felt like treasures to them. The water pressure in the shower was steady, the refrigerator hummed quietly without strange noises, and the heat didn't go out in the middle of the night. One afternoon, as Ethan was unpacking a box of books Lucas had given him, he felt a knock on the door. Claire was out at her new job as an assistant manager at the apartment complex, a position Lucas had offered her after seeing her dedication and organization skills. Ethan went to the door, peeking through the peephole before opening it. Standing outside was a boy around his age, with dark hair and a friendly grin. He held a basketball under one arm, his gaze curious. "Hey," the boy said, glancing around the hallway. "You're new here, right?" Ethan nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and shyness. "Yeah, we just moved in a couple weeks ago." The boy extended a hand. "I'm Jake. My mom and I live down the hall. Want to come play some basketball?" Ethan glanced back into the apartment, his heart pounding with excitement. Making friends had always been hard for him, especially with the kids in his old neighborhood. But here, in this new place, he felt braver, like he could finally start over. "Sure," he said, grabbing his sneakers and following Jake down to the small court in the courtyard. They spent the afternoon shooting hoops, laughing and talking in between games. Jake was easygoing, quick to share stories and jokes, and Ethan found himself laughing more than he had in years. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the court, he felt a strange but welcome sense of belonging. When he returned home that evening, he found Claire sitting at the kitchen table, her face relaxed and content. She looked up as he entered, her eyes lighting up as she took in his flushed cheeks and wide smile. "Looks like you had a good time," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Ethan nodded, dropping onto the chair beside her. "I made a friend. His name's Jake. He lives down the hall." Claire smiled, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "I'm glad, sweetheart. You deserve friends who make you feel good." They sat together in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the apartment filling the air. For the first time in years, Claire felt as if the constant weight on her shoulders had lifted, even if just a little. They had a home, now a real home. And maybe, just maybe, things would keep getting better. Though Ethan and Claire were adjusting well to their new life, the past still lingered in Ethan's mind. His memories of Calvin's taunts and threats were hard to shake, and he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see Calvin waiting for him around every corner. One afternoon, as he returned to Crestwood to visit an old classmate, Ethan's worst fear came true. As he rounded the corner near the convenience store, he saw Calvin and his friends lounging against the wall, their expressions smug and confident. Calvin noticed him immediately, his grin widening as he sauntered over. "Well, look who's back," he sneered, his voice filled with mockery. "Thought you could just run off, huh? Think you're too good for us now?" Ethan's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "I'm not looking for trouble, Calvin," he said quietly. "Just let me go." Calvin scoffed, stepping closer. "Trouble? You don't get to decide that. We still run this place, and you still owe me for bailing on us." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, a surge of anger and defiance rising within him. He remembered Lucas's words, the encouragement he'd offered, and he knew he couldn't let Calvin intimidate him any longer. "I don't owe you anything," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm done with you, Calvin. You don't scare me anymore." For a moment, Calvin looked taken aback, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. But then his face twisted into a sneer, and he shoved Ethan back. "Watch yourself, scavenger boy," he hissed, his voice laced with malice. "You might have run off, but you'll always be one of us." Ethan held his ground, refusing to back down. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not one of you, and I never will be." With that, he turned and walked away, his heart pounding as he forced himself to keep moving. He knew Calvin's threats weren't empty, but he also knew he couldn't live in fear forever. He had a new life now, a new home, and a future he was determined to protect. When he returned to the apartment that evening, he found Lucas waiting for him in the hallway, a knowing look in his eyes. "Everything all right?" Lucas asked, his voice calm. Ethan took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I just had to say goodbye to something." Lucas nodded, a look of understanding passing over his face. "Good. Sometimes that's exactly what you need." As they stepped into the apartment together, Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope and courage. He was no longer the scared kid hiding from bullies. He was stronger now, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan adjusted to life at his new school with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The building was larger than his old school, with long, brightly lit hallways and well-kept classrooms that hummed with quiet activity. The teachers here had higher expectations, and the students seemed more confident, like they'd always known they belonged here. At first, Ethan struggled to find his place. He felt out of sync, like he was constantly trying to catch up to a rhythm that everyone else understood effortlessly. But each day, he pushed himself a little harder, determined to keep up. Lucas had set up a meeting with one of the school's guidance counselors, Mrs. Holloway, who provided him with resources and offered tutoring sessions in the afternoons. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult math class, Ethan found himself sitting alone at a table in the library, struggling to make sense of the equations that filled his workbook. He sighed, rubbing his temples as frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Need some help with that?" Ethan looked up to see Jake standing there, holding his own workbook under one arm. Jake had been a good friend since they'd moved to the building, and they'd started hanging out regularly, playing basketball or working on homework together. Jake was easygoing and quick to laugh, making Ethan feel like he finally had someone who truly understood him. "Yeah," Ethan admitted with a sheepish smile. "Math isn't really my thing." Jake grinned, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. "No worries. It's not mine either, but Mrs. Holloway helped me figure out a few tricks. Want me to show you?" Ethan nodded eagerly, watching as Jake walked him through the steps, explaining the problems in a way that made them feel manageable. By the time they finished, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment, a glimmer of confidence taking root. "Thanks, Jake," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Jake shrugged, flashing him a friendly grin. "We're friends. Friends help each other." For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a genuine sense of belonging. He wasn't just getting by, he was growing, thriving, and building connections that felt solid and real. That evening, Claire sat on the couch in their apartment, a stack of bills spread out on the coffee table in front of her. She'd been doing everything she could to manage their expenses, working longer hours and cutting back on anything unnecessary. But the stack of bills seemed never-ending, a reminder that the past wasn't as easy to leave behind as she'd hoped. She glanced at the clock. It was almost 8 p.m., and Ethan still hadn't returned from his study session with Jake. Normally, she wouldn't worry, but tonight felt different. An old anxiety crept up, reminding her of the nights she used to spend pacing their old apartment, waiting for him to return home safely. Just as she was about to pick up her phone, the door opened, and Ethan stepped inside, his face flushed from the cold. He looked happier than she'd seen him in weeks, his eyes bright with excitement. "Hey, Mom," he greeted her, setting his backpack down by the door. "Sorry I'm late. Jake and I were finishing up some math problems, and he was showing me these shortcuts Mrs. Holloway taught him." Claire relaxed, letting out a small sigh of relief. "That's all right, honey. I'm glad you're enjoying school. It seems like you're really making progress." Ethan grinned, sitting down beside her on the couch. "I am. I really like it here, Mom. It's different." Claire smiled, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. You're working so hard." They sat together in comfortable silence, and Claire felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She knew that none of this would have been possible without Lucas's help. He'd given them not just a place to live, but a chance to rebuild, to grow into the people they were meant to be. Yet, even as she felt the warmth of gratitude, a lingering doubt gnawed at her. What if this new life slipped away? What if the fragile stability they'd built crumbled under the weight of her past mistakes? She couldn't shake the feeling that happiness was something she couldn't afford to hold on to, not fully, not yet. A few days later, Claire was returning from her shift at the apartment complex when she spotted Lucas standing by the entrance, talking with a woman in a tailored suit. The woman had an air of authority, her gaze sharp as she spoke with him, her voice carrying a hint of impatience. As Claire approached, Lucas looked up and waved, his face breaking into a warm smile. He excused himself from the conversation and walked over to her, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "Hey, Claire," he greeted her, his voice calm. "How was work?" Claire shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "Busy but good. We had a few new tenants move in, so it's been hectic." She glanced at the woman by the entrance, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Who's that?" "Oh," Lucas replied, glancing over his shoulder. "That's Margaret Turner. She's a regional investor, helping me look into some properties. Nothing too exciting, but she's thorough." Claire nodded, sensing there was more to the story than he was letting on. She didn't look too happy. Lucas chuckled, his gaze turning thoughtful. "She's cautious, more interested in numbers than people, I think. But she means well." They fell into step together, walking down the hallway toward her apartment. Claire felt a strange comfort in Lucas's presence, a calmness that had once felt foreign but was now becoming familiar. He had a way of making everything feel manageable, even when life threw its usual challenges their way. As they reached her door, Lucas turned to her, his expression serious but gentle. "Claire, I know this is all new for you, for both of you, but I want you to know that you're not alone. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Claire felt a lump form in her throat, his words touching a place deep inside her that she rarely let anyone see. She'd spent so many years fighting to survive, to shield Ethan from the hardships they faced, that the idea of letting someone and of trusting someone completely felt both terrifying and freeing. "Thank you, Lucas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what we'd do without you." Lucas smiled, his gaze warm. "You find a way, Claire. You always do. But I'm here to make it a little easier." As he left, Claire stood in the doorway, watching him disappear down the hall. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found someone they could trust, a true friend who wouldn't let them down. While life in the new apartment continued to improve, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the background, a shadow from his past waiting to catch up with him. He hadn't seen Calvin since their last encounter, but he couldn't forget the threats, the the sneering looks, the way Calvin seemed to hold power over him even now. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, he felt someone watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, and there, across the street, was Calvin, leaning against a street lamp, a smirk spreading across his face as their eyes met. Ethan's heart pounded, a mixture of fear and anger bubbling up inside him. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to show weakness, even as Calvin crossed the street and approached him with a swagger that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Long time no see, scavenger boy," Calvin sneered, his tone mocking. "Thought you could just run off and play nice in your little safe neighborhood, huh?" Ethan swallowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "Leave me alone, Calvin," he said, his voice firm. Calvin laughed, his eyes glinting with malice. "Oh, I will once you pay up. I heard your new friend's loaded. Maybe he can give you a little something for old time's sake." Ethan felt a surge of defiance, a newfound strength fueled by the support of his mom, Lucas, and his friends. "I don't owe you anything, Calvin," he replied, his voice steady. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Calvin's smirk faltered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. But then he sneered, stepping closer. "You'd better watch yourself, Ethan, because one day, your fancy friends won't be around to protect you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart racing, but his resolve unbroken. He knew Calvin's threats were serious, but he also knew he couldn't live in fear forever. He had something to fight for now, something worth protecting. When he got home, he found Claire waiting for him, her face lighting up with relief as he entered. "Hey, sweetheart," she greeted him, pulling him into a hug. "Everything all right?" Ethan nodded, though his mind was still reeling from the encounter. "Yeah, Mom? Everything's fine." As they sat together in the quiet warmth of their apartment, Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination. He was done running, done letting fear control his life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them head-on, with the strength and support of the people who believed in him. The next morning, Claire woke early, feeling a sense of purpose that hadn't been there in years. She'd spent so long struggling just to survive, but now, for the first time, she felt like she had the power to shape her own future. As she prepared breakfast, she thought about all the small victories they'd achieved since moving into the apartment, the new friendships Ethan had made, the stability of her job, the quiet confidence that had started to blossom within her. She was proud of herself, proud of the life she was building for her son. Ethan came into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He looked up at her with a warm smile, and Claire felt her heart swell with gratitude. "Good morning, Mom," he mumbled, sliding into his seat. "Morning, sweetheart," she replied, placing a plate of toast and eggs in front of him. "Big plans for the day?" Ethan shrugged, his eyes bright with excitement. "Jake and I are going to play basketball after school. Then I have that meeting with Mrs. Holloway." Claire nodded, a sense of pride filling her chest. "Sounds like a busy day. You're doing so well, Ethan. I'm really proud of you." He grinned, his face glowing with happiness. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." As they shared breakfast, Claire felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to face them. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building a life for herself and her son, a life filled with hope and possibility. One evening, after another busy day at her new job, Claire sat alone in the quiet of her apartment. Ethan was at Jake's, working on a school project, and for the first time in months, she had a few hours to herself. She made herself a cup of tea and settled into the armchair by the window, allowing herself a rare moment to unwind. The sound of a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up, surprised. She hadn't been expecting anyone. She rose and opened the door to find Lucas standing there, a gentle smile on his face. "Hey, Claire," he greeted her warmly. "I was in the building for a meeting with the board and thought I'd stop by, see how things are going." Claire stepped back, gesturing for him to come in. "Sure, come on in. I was just making some tea. Would you like some?" Lucas nodded, closing the door behind him. "That would be great, thanks." They settled into the small but comfortable living room, the soft hum of the city outside the window filling the quiet. Claire poured a cup of tea for Lucas and handed it to him, sitting across from him on the couch. "So, How's everything going with the job? Lucas asked, his voice calm and sincere. I've heard from the property manager that you're doing a great job. Claire felt a warm blush rise to her cheeks, and she gave a small, self-conscious laugh. It's been better than I expected, honestly. I mean, it's hard work, and there's a lot to keep up with, but I actually enjoy it. And it's given me a sense of stability I haven't felt in a long time. Lucas's face softened with pride. I'm glad to hear that, Claire. You've worked so hard to get here, and you deserve every bit of success. Claire looked down at her tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. Thank you, Lucas. I don't know what we would have done without you. It still feels surreal sometimes, like I'm waiting to wake up and find out it was all a dream. Lucas shook his head, his gaze steady. This is real, Claire, and you don't have to be afraid of losing it. You've built this life with your own hands, you and Ethan. I just gave a little nudge to help you get started. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her. She felt a sense of calm wash over her, a quiet reassurance that maybe, just maybe, they could truly leave the past behind. Thank you, Lucas, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. He reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. You don't have to thank me, Claire. Just keep believing in yourself and in Ethan. You're both stronger than you know. They continued talking, their conversation flowing easily, filled with shared stories and laughter. And as the evening wore on, Claire realized that Lucas wasn't just a mentor or a guide, he was becoming a true friend, someone she could trust and rely on. The next week, Lucas invited Claire and Ethan to a community event at a local park. It was a modest affair, booths set up along the grassy field, local vendors selling homemade crafts, and a small stage where a band played lively folk music. The sun was bright, casting a warm glow over the crowd, and the air buzzed with the sound of laughter and conversation. Ethan spotted Jake and his family near one of the booths, and with Claire's nod of approval, he ran off to join them. Claire watched him go, a soft smile on her face, as Lucas appeared at her side, holding 2 cups of lemonade. Here, he said, handing one to her. Thought you might be thirsty. Thank you, Claire replied, accepting the cup with a grateful smile. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? Lucas nodded, his gaze sweeping over the park. It is. It's good to see people coming together like this. I think it reminds us that we're all part of something bigger. They walked along the rows of booths, browsing handmade jewelry, pottery, and homemade jams. Claire felt an unfamiliar lightness in her chest, a sense of freedom that she hadn't felt in years. She looked over at Lucas, feeling a surge of gratitude. I don't know the last time I felt this at ease, she said quietly. I used to worry all the time about rent, about food, about keeping Ethan safe. But here, with you, it's like I can finally breathe. Lucas looked at her, his expression warm. You deserve peace, Claire. You and Ethan both. And I hope this is just the beginning of a new chapter for you. They continued their walk, sharing stories and laughing at the antics of a street performer who juggled brightly colored balls while riding a unicycle. The day passed in a blur of laughter and warmth, and as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the park, Claire felt a quiet happiness settle in her heart. When they finally said goodbye and returned home, Claire lay in bed, replaying the day's events in her mind. For the first time, she felt truly hopeful about the future, as though the life she'd always dreamed of was finally within reach. Just as things were beginning to feel stable, life threw another curveball. One afternoon, Claire received a call from the apartment's property manager, informing her that a plumbing issue had caused flooding in several units. Though it didn't affect their apartment directly, the incident created a temporary upheaval as maintenance scrambled to repair the damage. Claire spent the next few days working overtime, coordinating with the maintenance team and assisting tenants who'd been displaced by the flooding. She was exhausted, but she pushed through, determined to help as much as she could. She hadn't yet told Ethan about the situation, not wanting him to worry, but he could sense her stress. One evening, after a long day of managing the crisis, Claire returned home to find Ethan waiting for her, his face filled with concern. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "You look really tired." Claire gave him a reassuring smile, though her eyes were weary. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a bit of a rough week at work. Ethan frowned, watching her closely. You don't have to do it all on your own, you know. Maybe you could ask Lucas for help. Claire hesitated, feeling a surge of pride and protectiveness. She'd always done everything herself, always been the one to shoulder the burden. But now, looking into Ethan's concerned eyes, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry it alone. The next day, she called Lucas, explaining the situation. To her relief, he was more than willing to lend a hand, coordinating with the maintenance team and arranging temporary accommodations for the displaced tenants. With his support, the crisis was resolved smoothly, and Claire felt a renewed sense of gratitude for his steady presence in their lives. As they closed the last chapter of the crisis, Lucas gave her a knowing look, his voice gentle. Remember, Claire, you don't have to do it all alone. You have people who care about you, who want to help. Claire nodded, feeling the truth of his words sink in. She wasn't alone anymore, and that realization filled her with a strength she hadn't known she had. As the weeks passed, Ethan continued to thrive at school, his confidence growing with each new accomplishment. He joined the after-school basketball team, forming strong friendships with his teammates and finding a place where he truly belonged. The gym became a haven for him, a place where he could focus, push himself, and feel a sense of accomplishment. One day, after a particularly intense practice, his coach, Mr. Blake, pulled him aside, a look of approval in his eyes. Ethan, I'm really impressed with your progress, he said, his tone sincere. You've got a lot of potential, and I think you could go far with this if you keep working hard. Ethan felt a surge of pride, his face lighting up with a grin. Thank you, coach. I'll keep doing my best. As he walked home that evening, his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He was no longer just a kid trying to survive. He was becoming someone who could make his mom proud and create his own path. When he got home, he found Claire waiting for him in the kitchen, a warm smile on her face. She hugged him tightly, her pride evident in her gaze. You're doing amazing, Ethan, she said softly. I'm so proud of you. Ethan hugged her back, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He was no longer just her son, he was becoming her partner, her support, someone she could rely on. And he knew that, together, they could face anything. Despite the new life they were building, the shadows of the past weren't so easy to shake. One evening, while returning from a tutoring session at school, Ethan saw Calvin standing on the corner, his face twisted in a familiar sneer. The sight of him sent a chill down Ethan's spine, memories of threats and taunts rushing back. Calvin stepped forward, blocking his path. Thought you could just run off and leave all this behind? He sneered, his voice laced with bitterness. Ethan's heart raced, but he forced himself to stand tall, meeting Calvin's gaze without flinching. I don't have anything to say to you, Calvin, he replied calmly. I've moved on. Calvin laughed, the sound hollow and mocking. Moved on, huh? You think you're better than us now, don't you? Ethan felt a surge of defiance, the strength he'd gained over the past few months bolstering him. No, Calvin, he said, his voice steady. But I don't have to live like this anymore. I have a choice, and I'm choosing a different path. For a moment, Calvin looked taken aback, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But then he scoffed, stepping back with a shrug. Whatever, man. Go play nice in your little safe neighborhood. But remember, you'll always be one of us. As Calvin turned and walked away, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He knew that Calvin's words came from a place of hurt, of feeling left behind. But he also knew that he couldn't change Calvin, he could only focus on his own path, his own future. When he returned home that night, he told Claire about the encounter, her face filling with concern. But he reassured her, his voice calm and resolute. I'm not afraid of him anymore, Mom, he said softly. I know who I am now. Claire hugged him tightly, her heart filled with pride. She knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with courage and strength. In the months following the encounter with Calvin, Ethan and Claire's lives began to settle into a steady rhythm. They had each found a sense of purpose, Ethan with his studies and basketball, and Claire with her job, where she was becoming a valued member of the team. Though challenges still arose, they faced them together, finding strength in the life they were building. One afternoon, Lucas invited them to a small gathering he was hosting for the tenants in his building. It was a modest event, held in the building's courtyard, where folding chairs and tables were set up under a canopy of string lights. Neighbors brought dishes of food, creating a potluck-style meal that felt like a celebration of their community. As the evening unfolded, Claire watched Ethan laugh and chat with his friends, the carefree joy in his expression reminding her of the boy he'd been before hardship had weighed them both down. She felt a swell of gratitude as she looked around, taking in the warmth of the gathering, the sense of belonging that had always seemed out of reach. Lucas approached, holding a plate of food in one hand and offering her a warm smile. "How are you feeling, Claire? You look happy." Claire nodded, her eyes shining. "I am. For the first time in years, I actually feel at home. It's still hard to believe, honestly." Lucas's expression softened. "You've worked hard to get here, Claire. You deserve this." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the evening settle over the courtyard. For a moment, Claire allowed herself to imagine a future where this happiness was permanent, where the fear and instability of the past were nothing more than distant memories. A few weeks later, Claire received unexpected news from her supervisor. The property management company was offering her a promotion, a role with greater responsibility and better pay. She sat in her supervisor's office, stunned, as the offer sank in. "Claire, you've been doing an excellent job," her supervisor said with a smile. "Your dedication and hard work haven't gone unnoticed. We think you'd be a perfect fit for this position." Claire nodded, her heart pounding with excitement. She'd never imagined she would come this far, that someone would see her potential and offer her a chance to rise. When she returned home that evening, she found Ethan in the kitchen, working on his homework. She sat down beside him, her face glowing with excitement. "Ethan, guess what?" she said, barely able to contain her smile. "I got a promotion." Ethan's face lit up, his eyes shining with pride. "Mom, that's amazing. I knew you could do it." They hugged, both of them filled with joy and relief. This promotion was more than just a job. It was proof that their hard work was paying off, that they were building something lasting and real. Later that evening, as they celebrated with takeout from their favorite restaurant, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving, creating a life that she and Ethan could be proud of. Ethan's basketball team had been practicing for weeks, preparing for their first big game of the season. The gym was buzzing with energy as the players warmed up, the crowd filling the bleachers, cheering and clapping in anticipation. Claire sat in the front row, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. She glanced around, spotting Lucas a few rows behind her, giving her a reassuring nod. His presence was a steadying force, a reminder that they weren't facing this journey alone. When the game began, Ethan played with a focus and determination that made Claire's heart swell with pride. He moved across the court with a grace and confidence she hadn't seen before, his face set with a fierce determination. He'd come so far, grown so much, and watching him now, she knew he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the final buzzer sounded and Ethan's team emerged victorious, Claire leaped to her feet, cheering with all her might. Ethan's face lit up as he spotted her, his smile wide and full of joy. He ran over, hugging her tightly, his excitement contagious. "Mom, we did it!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with pride. Claire hugged him back, her own face glowing with happiness. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. You've worked so hard for this." They celebrated with the team, surrounded by laughter and cheers. As they walked home later, their hearts filled with joy, Claire felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known before. They were no longer just hoping for a better life, they were living it, day by day, moment by moment. One chilly autumn afternoon, Claire was surprised by a knock at the door. She opened it to find an unexpected visitor, her sister, Sarah. They hadn't spoken in years, their relationship strained by misunderstandings and the distance that hardship had placed between them. "Claire," Sarah greeted her, her voice tentative. "It's been a long time." Claire nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions. "Yes, it has." They sat down together, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Sarah had always been supportive in her own way, but life had taken them on different paths, and their relationship had suffered as a result. Now, seeing her sister sitting across from her, Claire felt a wave of nostalgia, a longing for the connection they'd once shared. "I heard about everything you've been through," Sarah said softly, "and I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I should have been there for you." Claire looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "We've both been through a lot, Sarah. I don't blame you. I'm just glad you're here." They spent the afternoon catching up, sharing stories and memories, rebuilding the bond they'd once had. By the time Sarah left, Claire felt a renewed sense of peace, a feeling of wholeness she hadn't known was missing. She realized that, just as she and Ethan were building a new life, she could also mend the pieces of her past, creating a foundation of strength and connection. As the school year continued, Ethan found himself excelling in his classes, his confidence growing with each new accomplishment. But his progress didn't go unnoticed, and not all of his peers were supportive. One afternoon, as he was walking home, a group of older boys approached him, their expressions smug and challenging. "Hey, Ethan," one of them sneered, crossing his arms. "I heard you're some kind of basketball star now. Too good for us, huh?" Ethan felt his stomach tighten, memories of Calvin and the taunts he'd endured surfacing in his mind. But he forced himself to stay calm, meeting their gazes with quiet strength. "I'm just doing my best," he replied, his voice steady. "It doesn't mean I'm better than anyone." The boys laughed, their taunts echoing in the empty street. But Ethan refused to let them shake him. He knew who he was now, knew the value of his hard work and the strength he'd gained. As the boys eventually walked away, he felt a surge of pride, a sense of accomplishment that came not from the game but from standing his ground. He was no longer afraid of the shadows of his past. He was ready to face the future, no matter what challenges it held. When he returned home, he told Claire about the encounter, her face filling with pride as she listened. "You're growing up, Ethan," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "And I'm so proud of the man you're becoming." They held each other, their bond stronger than ever, both of them filled with the quiet certainty that they could face anything as long as they had each other. As winter approached, Lucas shared exciting news with Claire and Ethan. His foundation had been approved for a new community program, an initiative to provide resources and mentorship to families in need. It was a project close to his heart, one he'd been planning for years, and he wanted Claire and Ethan to be a part of it. Claire listened in awe as Lucas explained his vision, his passion for helping others filling the room with warmth. He talked about workshops, tutoring sessions, and career training, all aimed at giving families the tools they needed to build a better future. "And I was hoping," Lucas continued, his gaze steady, "that you might consider joining us, Claire. You've been through so much, and your perspective would be invaluable. You understand what these families are going through, and I think you could really make a difference." Claire felt a surge of emotion, a sense of purpose that resonated deep within her. She'd spent so many years just trying to survive, but now she had the opportunity to help others, to give back in a way she'd never imagined. "I'd love to," she replied, her voice filled with determination. "Thank you, Lucas. This means so much to me." They shared a look of understanding, both of them united by their desire to create a better world, one where people could rise above their struggles and find hope. As the holiday season approached, Claire and Ethan prepared to celebrate their first Christmas in their new home. They decorated a small tree, hung lights around the windows, and filled the apartment with the warmth of the season. On Christmas morning, they exchanged gifts, small tokens, but filled with love and gratitude. Claire gave Ethan a new pair of basketball shoes, and Ethan surprised her with a handmade card, his words heartfelt and filled with appreciation for everything she'd done for him. They spent the day together, sharing laughter, memories, and dreams for the future. And as they sat together by the tree, their apartment aglow with the soft light of the holiday, they felt a sense of peace and joy that filled every corner of their hearts. For Claire, this was more than just a holiday. It was a celebration of everything they'd overcome, a testament to the strength they'd found in each other and the life they'd built together. And for Ethan, it was the beginning of a new journey, a path filled with hope, possibility, and the promise of a future he'd once thought impossible. With the new year came a sense of anticipation and renewed purpose. Claire threw herself into her work with the foundation, eager to make a difference. She spent her days meeting with families, sharing her own experiences, and offering guidance. It was a role she never imagined for herself, but as the weeks passed, she found herself thriving in the position. One afternoon, Claire was leading a workshop on budgeting for single parents. The small room was filled with people of all ages, each one hoping to find a way to make their income stretch a little further. As she spoke, sharing practical tips she'd learned through years of experience, she noticed a young mother in the front row, her eyes wide and attentive. After the workshop ended, the woman approached her, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Claire," she said softly. "Hearing you talk about all of this, it makes me feel like I'm not alone. Like maybe I can make things work too." Claire felt a surge of pride, her heart swelling with empathy and understanding. She placed a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder, meeting her gaze with kindness. "You can do this. It won't be easy, but you have the strength to keep going." As the woman nodded, her face filled with renewed hope, Claire felt a quiet sense of fulfillment settle over her. She was no longer just surviving, she was giving back, using her story to help others find their way. It was a transformation she hadn't expected, a purpose she hadn't foreseen, but one she embraced with open arms. With basketball season in full swing, Ethan's skills on the court had improved rapidly. He practiced every day, pushing himself harder, fueled by his coach's encouragement and his own desire to make his mom proud. The team had begun to rely on him as a steady player, someone who could keep calm under pressure and bring his best to each game. One day, during a particularly intense practice, Coach Blake pulled Ethan aside, his expression serious. "Ethan, I've been thinking about your progress. You have real talent, and I think you're ready to start playing in the Advanced League." Ethan's eyes widened, a mix of excitement and anxiety filling him. He knew the Advanced League would be challenging, but the chance to grow and compete at a higher level was something he dreamed of. "Thank you, Coach," he replied, his voice steady. "I'll give it my best." Over the next few weeks, Ethan pushed himself harder than ever, balancing his schoolwork, practices, and friendships. He felt a new sense of pride and responsibility, a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was capable of achieving his goals. As he lay in bed one evening, reflecting on his journey, he thought about how far he'd come from a boy struggling to survive to a young man with a clear sense of purpose. He knew he still had challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them, stronger and more determined than ever. One quiet afternoon, Claire received a letter from an unexpected source, Calvin's mother. It was a brief note, written in careful handwriting, expressing gratitude for the influence Claire and Lucas had had on Ethan's life and the hope it had given her to see someone rise above difficult circumstances. Claire was surprised but touched, her heart swelling with compassion as she read the letter. She hadn't thought much about Calvin since they'd moved, but now, reading his mother's words, she felt a pang of empathy. She knew the pain of watching a loved one struggle, the fear of not being able to protect them from the world. She decided to respond, writing a thoughtful note in return, offering her support and sharing words of encouragement. It was a small gesture, but one she hoped would bring comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path forward. When she finished, she looked up, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had come full circle, no longer just running from the past, but facing it with grace and compassion, ready to leave it behind once and for all. Late one night, Claire received a phone call from one of the families she'd been working with at the foundation. The mother, a single parent with 2 young children, was in a state of panic. Her landlord had just issued an eviction notice, and she didn't know where to turn. Without hesitation, Claire sprang into action. She called Lucas, explaining the situation, and within hours, they'd managed to arrange temporary housing for the family and scheduled a meeting with a lawyer who specialized in tenant rights. The relief in the mother's voice as Claire informed her of the arrangements was overwhelming, a reminder of the importance of their work. As she hung up the phone, Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to continue helping families find stability and hope. When she returned home that night, exhausted but fulfilled, she found Ethan waiting for her, his face filled with pride as she recounted the events of the evening. They sat together, sharing stories of their day, both of them filled with gratitude for the lives they were building. The day of Ethan's first Advanced League game arrived, bringing with it a mixture of excitement and nerves. The gym was packed with students, parents, and teachers, all eager to watch the teams compete. Claire sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, her heart pounding with pride. As the game began, Ethan moved across the court with a focus and intensity that left her in awe. He was calm and confident, his movements precise, his determination evident in every play. His team played with energy and unity, each member supporting the other, each move carefully calculated. With just a few minutes left on the clock, the score was tied, and the crowd's anticipation grew. Ethan took his position, his gaze steady as he prepared for the final play. With a swift, powerful movement, he dribbled the ball past the defense, launching a perfect shot just as the buzzer sounded. The ball sailed through the hoop, landing with a satisfying swish. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Ethan's teammates rushed to congratulate him, their faces alight with victory. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes found Claire's, her face beaming with pride and joy. She waved, her heart filled with love and admiration, and in that moment, they both knew that this was just the beginning of a future filled with possibility. As Claire's work with the foundation grew, so did her responsibilities. Lucas had been watching her closely, impressed by her dedication and skill, and he felt that it was time to offer her a new opportunity. One afternoon, he invited her to his office, where they discussed her work, her accomplishments, and her vision for the future. "Claire," he began, his voice calm but filled with purpose, "you've done an incredible job here. You have a natural ability to connect with people, to understand their needs, and to offer support that truly makes a difference." Claire listened, her heart pounding as he continued. "I'd like to offer you a new role," he said, his gaze steady. "A leadership position within the foundation. It would involve overseeing multiple projects, training new team members, and expanding our outreach. It's a big responsibility, but I believe you're more than capable." Claire was stunned, her mind racing as she processed his words. She'd never dreamed of such an opportunity, but as she looked into Lucas's eyes, she saw the faith he had in her, the belief that she could rise to the challenge. "Thank you, Lucas," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. I'd be honored to take on this role." They shook hands, sealing the agreement. And as Claire left his office, she felt a newfound sense of purpose and determination. She was ready to take this next step, to continue making a difference and helping others find the strength to rebuild. As the school year came to an end, Ethan was surprised to find that he'd been nominated for an award recognizing his leadership and sportsmanship. The award was a symbol of his growth, his dedication, and his determination to succeed against all odds. At the awards ceremony, Ethan stood on stage, his heart filled with pride as he accepted the award. He glanced at the crowd, his gaze finding Claire and Lucas, both of whom were watching with pride. In that moment, he felt a sense of gratitude that ran deeper than words of gratitude for the journey, the support, and the unwavering belief that had brought him here. In his acceptance speech, Ethan shared a few words about his journey, his struggles, and the strength he'd found along the way. "I've learned that no matter how difficult things may seem, there's always a way forward," he said, his voice steady. "There are people who care, people who believe in you, even when you can't believe in yourself. And I'm grateful for every single person who helped me get here." The crowd applauded, their faces filled with admiration and respect. And as Ethan left the stage, he knew that he was ready to create a legacy of his own, a legacy of kindness, resilience, and hope. With her new position at the foundation, Claire was able to move Ethan and herself into a small but beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood. It was the home they had always dreamed of, a place filled with warmth, light, and the promise of a brighter future. They spent the first few days painting the walls, arranging furniture, and filling the space with memories. As they settled in, Claire felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling of completion that she hadn't known before. She and Ethan had come full circle, building a life filled with stability, love, and purpose. One evening, as they sat together in their new living room, Ethan looked around, his face filled with pride. "We did it, Mom," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We really did it." Claire nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, we did, and I couldn't be prouder of us." They sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of their new home surrounding them. And in that moment, they knew that they had created a life worth living, a life filled with love, resilience, and the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Years later, Ethan found himself walking down a familiar sidewalk, his mind filled with memories of the journey that had brought him here. He was now a young man, a college graduate, with dreams of his own and a commitment to giving back to the community that had supported him. One afternoon, as he walked past a small diner, he noticed a young boy sitting on the curb, his face weary and his clothes worn. The boy looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's, and Ethan felt a surge of recognition, a reminder of the boy he'd once been. He knelt down, offering the boy a warm smile. "Hey there," he said softly. "Are you all right?" The boy nodded, but his face was filled with uncertainty. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a small business card with his contact information. "If you ever need someone to talk to or a little help, don't hesitate to call me," he said, pressing the card into the boy's hand. The boy looked at him, his eyes wide with gratitude, and Ethan gave him a reassuring nod. As he walked away, Ethan felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he was carrying forward the kindness and compassion that had once saved him. And somewhere in his heart, he knew that this was just the beginning, that the circle of kindness would continue, one life at a time, one act of compassion at a time. If you enjoyed Claire and Ethan's journey of resilience, compassion, and the power of second chances, please hit that subscribe button and join our community for more stories that inspire hope and strength. And don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment to let us know your thoughts. Every subscriber helps us bring more stories to life, so thank you for being part of the journey.